I can still feel the weight of his head against my shoulder. Even now, months later, when I close my eyes and let the memory surface, it returns with startling clarity. The particular heaviness of another person's trust, the way it settles into your bones and changes everything about how you understand yourself in the world. It was a Tuesday night in November. I remember because Isaiah had complained about having 3 exams that week, and I had listened with the careful attention I always gave to his worries, filing away each detail as if they were sacred texts. The apartment was his, a cramped studio near campus that smelled perpetually of coffee grounds and the lavender detergent his mother sent him. I had grown to love that smell, the way it clung to my clothes after our study sessions, marking me as someone who belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere wasn't quite mine. The television cast its blue-white glow across the room, painting shadows that shifted and danced with each cut of the film. Some thriller Isaiah had picked, something with car chases and dialogue that seemed written by committee. I wasn't really watching. I never was, not entirely. My attention had developed this habit of splitting itself between the screen and the person beside me, cataloging the small movements that most people would never notice. The way Isaiah's fingers drummed against his thigh during tense scenes. How he unconsciously mirrored the posture of whatever character he found most compelling. The soft intake of breath when something on screen surprised him. We had settled into our usual positions without discussion. Isaiah claimed the corner of the couch where the arm met the back, one leg folded under him, the other stretched toward me. I sat straighter, more formal somehow, though I couldn't have explained why. There was a bowl of popcorn between us, mostly empty now, kernels scattered across the cushions like evidence of some small celebration. The apartment was warm in that way small spaces get when 2 people have been breathing in them for hours, when the outside world feels distant and theoretical. Isaiah had been quiet for the last 20 minutes of the film, longer than usual. When I glanced over, I could see his eyelids growing heavy the way they did during late lectures or when he studied too long without breaks. His head had begun that slow, inevitable drift that comes just before sleep claims you entirely. I should have said something. Should have suggested we call it a night, that he go to bed properly instead of falling asleep on the couch. But I didn't. Some selfish part of me wanted to see what would happen if I simply remained still and quiet, if I let the moment unfold without interference. The weight came gradually, then all at once. His temple against my shoulder blade first, just a brush of contact that could have been accidental. Then more purposeful, his entire head settling into the space where my arm met my torso. The shift was so natural it felt inevitable, as if we had been moving toward this exact configuration our entire friendship. His breathing deepened and slowed, finding the rhythm of genuine sleep. I stopped breathing entirely for what felt like minutes. Not from discomfort, but from the sudden, overwhelming awareness of how significant this small act was. Isaiah trusted me enough to fall asleep against me. More than that, he had chosen to let his guard down completely, to make himself vulnerable in a way that people rarely do with others. The weight of his head was nothing compared to the weight of that trust. My shoulder began to ache almost immediately, but I wouldn't have moved for anything. I sat there, more still than I had ever been, watching the film continue its predictable arc while something entirely different played out in the space between Isaiah's sleeping form and my hyper-aware consciousness. Every few minutes, he would shift slightly, adjusting his position with the unconscious grace of someone completely at ease. Each movement sent small electric shocks through my system, reminders of his presence, his closeness, the impossible intimacy of this accidental moment. I found myself studying his face and profile, memorizing details I had never allowed myself to notice so directly before. The way his eyelashes cast shadows on his cheeks, the slight part of his lips as he breathed, the faint line between his eyebrows that appeared, even in sleep, as if some part of him was always thinking, always processing. He looked younger somehow, softer, stripped of the confident energy he carried through his waking hours. The room felt suspended, caught between the ordinary Tuesday night it had been and something else entirely, something I couldn't yet name. The film's soundtrack swelled and receded, meaningless now, just background noise to the sound of Isaiah's steady breathing and the thunderous beating of my own heart. I wondered if he could hear it, if the rhythm might wake him. I wondered if I wanted it to. Time moved strangely. Minutes felt like hours, but also like seconds. I was acutely aware of every sensation. The warmth radiating from Isaiah's body, the weight of the blanket we were now sharing, the way the light from the television painted everything in shades of blue and silver. I was aware, too, of my own careful stillness, the way I held myself like a statue, afraid that even the smallest movement might break whatever spell had settled over us. This was new territory for me, uncharted in every sense. I had never been the person others leaned on, literally or figuratively. I was the one who faded into backgrounds, who observed rather than participated, who moved through the world with the careful invisibility of someone who had learned early that being noticed often meant being hurt. But here was Isaiah, vibrant and magnetic Isaiah, using my body as his pillow, my presence as his comfort. I thought about all the small moments that had led us here. The first time he had laughed at something I said, really laughed, not the polite chuckle most people offer my attempts at humor. The way he had started seeking me out between classes, appearing at my usual table in the library, asking if I wanted to grab coffee. How naturally our friendship had developed, without the awkward negotiations that usually accompanied my attempts at human connection. Isaiah had simply decided we belonged in each other's lives, and somehow, impossibly, it had worked. But this felt different. This felt like a door opening to something I hadn't dared to imagine. The possibility that my feelings, the ones I kept so carefully hidden, might not be entirely one-sided. That the attention I paid to Isaiah's every gesture might be returned in ways I was only beginning to understand. The credits began to roll, white text against black, but neither of us moved. Isaiah's breathing remained deep and even. My shoulder had progressed from aching to genuinely painful, but I welcomed the discomfort as proof that this was real, that I wasn't dreaming or imagining the weight of him against me. I sat there in the flickering light of the television, holding perfectly still, holding this moment like something precious and fragile that might shatter if I breathed too hard. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows, reminding me there was a world beyond this couch, beyond this room, beyond this perfect suspension of time. But it felt distant, irrelevant. Everything that mattered was here, in the space between Isaiah's sleeping form and my careful, wakeful attention. I closed my eyes and let myself exist fully in this moment, this wait, this unexpected gift of trust and closeness. I didn't know yet what it meant. I didn't know if Isaiah would remember falling asleep on me, or if he would pretend it never happened. I didn't know if this was the beginning of something or simply a beautiful accident that would never repeat itself. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that something had changed. Something in the careful architecture of our friendship had shifted, and I would never be able to go back to the person I had been before I understood what it felt like to be someone's chosen resting place. I have always been the kind of person who exists in the margins of other people's stories. In high school, I was the one teachers forgot to call on, the name that guidance counselors had to check twice on their rosters. I perfected the art of strategic invisibility early, learning to occupy space without claiming it, to be present without demanding attention. It wasn't shyness exactly, though most people assumed that was what it was. It was more like a careful recession from the world, a deliberate smallness that kept me safe from the complications that seemed to follow people who dared to be fully themselves. My mother used to worry about this quality in me. She would watch me at family gatherings, hovering at the edges of conversations, and I could see the concern in her eyes. She never said anything directly, but I caught her mentioning it to my father in those hushed kitchen conversations parents think their children can't hear. "He's so quiet," she would say. "I wish he would put himself out there more. Make some friends." But putting myself out there felt like standing naked in a snowstorm. Safer to watch, to listen, to learn the rhythms of other people's lives without risking the exposure of joining them. College was supposed to be different. That was what everyone told me. Anyway, you'll find your people in college, they said. You'll discover who you're meant to be. But those first months felt like an extension of everything that had come before. I attended lectures and took careful notes and retreated to my dorm room to study alone. I observed my floor mates forming friendships with the easy camaraderie I had never managed to access. I told myself I preferred solitude, that I was naturally introverted, that some people were simply built for different kinds of lives. Then came the group project that changed everything. Introduction to Modern Literature, a class I had chosen because I thought it would be safe, predictable. Books and analysis and written assignments I could complete in the privacy of my own space. But Professor Chun had other ideas about collaborative learning, about the value of discussion and shared interpretation. She assigned us to groups of 3, and somehow, through whatever algorithm of chance governs these things, I found myself paired with Isaiah Morrison and a girl named Claire who rarely showed up to class. I knew who Isaiah was, of course. Everyone did. He was the type of person who commanded attention without seeming to try, who could walk into a room and immediately become its center of gravity. He had this way of talking to people that made them feel like they were the only person in the world, at least for those few minutes. I had watched him hold court in the campus coffee shop, surrounded by a rotating cast of friends and admirers, and I had assumed he existed in an entirely different universe from mine. But when Claire disappeared after the first week, leaving Isaiah and me to tackle the project together, something unexpected happened. He didn't seem frustrated by my quietness the way most people did. He didn't try to fill every silence with chatter or treat my careful responses as problems to be solved. Instead, he listened when I spoke, really listened, as if my thoughts on Sylvia Plath and James Baldwin carried the same weight as his own insights. Our first real conversation happened in the library, hunched over photocopied pages and highlighted passages. Isaiah had made some observation about the way Baldwin wrote about exile, about the particular loneliness of being estranged from the place you should call home. I found myself responding without the usual careful editing of my thoughts, telling him about a passage that had stayed with me, about the way certain writers could make you feel less alone in your own strangeness. He looked at me, then, with something I had rarely seen directed my way. Genuine interest. Not polite attention or obligatory inclusion, but real curiosity about what I might have to say next. It was like being seen through new eyes, like discovering I had been visible all along and simply hadn't noticed. The project stretched on longer than it needed to. We both knew we had enough material after the second week, but Isaiah kept suggesting additional meetings, new angles to explore. We moved from the library to coffee shops, from coffee shops to his apartment. Each session felt less like academic work and more like an extended conversation between two people who were surprised to discover how much they enjoyed each other's company. Isaiah had this way of asking questions that revealed more than they seemed to. He would wonder aloud about my thoughts on everything from the books we were reading to the music playing in whatever cafe we had chosen. He remembered details I had shared in passing, followed up on throwaway comments I hadn't expected anyone to catch. Slowly, carefully, he constructed a portrait of who I was that felt more complete than any version I had ever shown to another person. What surprised me most was how natural it felt to exist in Isaiah's orbit. I had always assumed that being friends with someone like him would require a fundamental change in my personality, some transformation into someone more outgoing, more entertaining, more worthy of his attention. But Isaiah seemed to appreciate the very qualities that had always made me feel like a social failure. He valued my careful observations, my tendency to think before speaking, my ability to listen without judgment. He started appearing in my life outside of our official meetings. He would materialize at my usual table in the library, sliding into the chair across from me as if we had planned to meet. He began including me in group conversations, drawing me into discussions with the same easy confidence he brought to everything else. Under his influence, I found myself speaking up more in class, offering opinions I would have kept to myself before. The friendship deepened gradually, then suddenly. Study sessions that turned into long dinners. Casual invitations that became standing plans. Isaiah, suggesting we grab coffee after our Tuesday. Lecture became Isaiah, assuming we would grab coffee. Then dinner, then maybe walk around campus talking about everything and nothing until the buildings grew quiet around us. I had never had a friend like Isaiah before. I had never been someone's chosen companion, never been the person another person actively sought out. The novelty of it was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. I found myself analyzing every interaction for signs that his interest was waning, that he was beginning to see me the way most people eventually did, as someone pleasant enough but ultimately forgettable. But Isaiah kept showing up, kept asking questions, kept treating our friendship like something valuable, something worth cultivating and protecting. And slowly, carefully, I began to believe that maybe I was the kind of person who could be chosen after all. The tradition began with Isaiah, the way most things between us seemed to. Finals week was approaching like a storm we could see gathering on the horizon, and he had this idea that we needed something to look forward to, some ritual that would mark the end of another semester survived. He suggested movie nights, not just one evening, but a series of them, something we could count on when the stress of exams and papers threatened to overwhelm everything else. I should finish my constitutional law essay, I told him when he first proposed it. I should review my notes for organic chemistry. I should do all the responsible things that good students do in the weeks before finals. But Isaiah had this way of making his ideas sound less like suggestions and more like foregone conclusions, and somehow I found myself agreeing before I had fully processed what I was committing to. His apartment transformed in the evenings. During the day, it maintained the chaotic energy of someone juggling too many commitments, textbooks scattered across every surface, coffee mugs creating rings on his desk, laundry in various states of cleanliness draped over chairs. But when the sun went down and he turned on the string lights he had hung around the windows, the space became something different. Softer, more intentional, like a private theater where the outside world lost its ability to intrude. The first night felt like an experiment, both of us slightly uncertain about how to inhabit this new version of our friendship. Isaiah presented me with a bowl of popcorn as if it were a formal offering, a ceremonial acknowledgement of what we were attempting to create together. I had never been someone who knew how to receive gestures like this, small kindnesses that seemed to carry more weight than their surface simplicity suggested. But Isaiah had a way of making even my awkwardness feel acceptable, even charming. We developed our own rhythm quickly. Isaiah would spend the first 10 minutes of any film providing commentary on the opening credits, sharing obscure facts about directors or actors that he had accumulated through some mysterious process of cultural osmosis. I would listen and add my own observations when they occurred to me, surprised to discover that my thoughts on cinematography or narrative structure seemed to genuinely interest him. We fell into an easy pattern of shared attention, watching together in a way that felt more intimate than simply occupying the same physical space. The second week brought a subtle shift in our arrangement. Where we had initially maintained the careful distance of people still learning how to be comfortable with each other, Isaiah began to claim space on the couch with less hesitation. He would stretch his legs across the cushions, sometimes letting his feet rest near my thigh. Small gestures that tested the boundaries of our physical proximity without crossing any lines that might create awkwardness between us. I found myself hyper-aware of these small encroachments, the way Isaiah's presence seemed to expand to fill the available space around him. Not aggressively, but naturally, like water finding its level. When he reached for popcorn, his arm would brush against mine. When he laughed at something on screen, he would lean slightly in my direction, as if his amusement was something he wanted to share physically as well as emotionally. But it was the third week that changed everything fundamental about those evenings. Isaiah had chosen some thriller whose plot I can barely remember now. Something about international espionage and betrayals that seemed to require constant exposition. We had settled into what had become our usual positions on the couch. The bowl of popcorn balanced on the cushion between us, the familiar weight of the blanket we had begun sharing without discussion. The apartment was warmer that night, December's chill making itself known outside while the radiator worked overtime to keep the small space comfortable. Isaiah had complained about the heating bill, but he seemed reluctant to lower the temperature, as if the warmth was part of what made these evenings feel separate from the rest of our lives. 20 minutes into the film, Isaiah shifted. Not the restless movement of someone trying to find a comfortable position, but something more purposeful. He adjusted the pillow behind him and let himself sink deeper into the couch, and in the process, closed the careful distance we had maintained between our bodies. His thigh pressed against mine through the blanket, warm and solid and impossible to ignore. I tried to focus on the complicated plot about double agents and stolen information, but my awareness had narrowed to the places where Isaiah's body touched mine. I was hyper-conscious of every breath, every small movement, the way he would occasionally reach for popcorn without pulling away from our shared warmth. The contact felt both completely natural and electrically charged, as if we had been building toward this moment of connection through all our previous evenings together. Then, without any warning or preamble, Isaiah let his head tip sideways. The movement was slow, deliberate in a way that made it impossible to mistake for accident. His temple came to rest against my shoulder, and I felt his entire body relax into the contact with a soft exhale that sounded like relief. The gesture was so natural it felt inevitable, as if we had been moving toward this moment of physical intimacy through all our careful negotiations of space and boundaries. But it was also shocking in its directness, more personal than anything that had passed between us before. Isaiah had made a choice to use my body as his anchor, to trust me with the vulnerability of rest. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge what he had done, or ask if it was acceptable. He simply arranged himself against me, as if my shoulder had been designed specifically for his comfort, and within minutes, his breathing had deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. I sat frozen, afraid that any movement might wake him, or worse, might signal that this wasn't something I welcomed. Because I did welcome it, with an intensity that surprised me. I wanted to be the person Isaiah chose to rest against, the safe harbor he could count on when exhaustion overtook him. But I also had no idea what accepting this role meant, or what obligations it might create between us. The movie played on, forgotten now, just background noise to the much more compelling reality of Isaiah's sleeping form against my shoulder. I could feel the warmth of his body through his sweater, could smell his shampoo and the faint trace of the cologne he sometimes wore to classes he cared about impressing. Everything about the moment felt both completely natural and utterly transgressive, as if we had crossed some invisible line that I hadn't even realized was there. My arm began to ache after the first hour, but I didn't dare move. This felt too precious, too fragile to risk disturbing. Instead, I let myself exist fully in the sensation of being needed, of being chosen as someone worthy of this kind of trust. Isaiah could have gone to bed properly, could have fallen asleep in his own space with proper pillows and blankets. Instead, he had chosen to make me his resting place. The weight of his head against my shoulder was heavier than anything I'd ever carried, not because of its physical mass, but because of what it represented. Trust, intimacy. The kind of closeness I had observed in other people's friendships, but had never believed might be available to someone like me. When the credits finally rolled, Isaiah stirred but didn't fully wake. He mumbled something incomprehensible and shifted slightly, but his head remained against my shoulder, his body still curved toward mine. I reached for the remote with my free hand and turned off the television, plunging us into the soft amber glow of the string lights. I sat there in the quiet apartment, listening to Isaiah's steady breathing and trying to understand what had just happened between us. It felt like more than friendship, but I didn't have words for what else it might be. All I knew was that something had shifted, some boundary had been crossed, and there would be no going back to the careful distance we had maintained before. The night stretched ahead of us, full of possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. But for now, it was enough to sit in the warm darkness, holding perfectly still, protecting this trust that had been placed in me like something sacred and irreplaceable. The morning after brought no acknowledgement, no awkward conversation about what had happened between us on his couch. Isaiah woke naturally around dawn, lifting his head from my shoulder with a soft groan and a mumbled apology about falling asleep during the movie. He stretched, yawned, offered me coffee, and moved through his morning routine as if sleeping against me had been the most ordinary thing in the world. I watched him carefully for signs of regret or embarrassment, some indication that he felt we had crossed a line that should have remained uncrossed. But Isaiah seemed entirely at ease, chatting about his upcoming exam schedule while he made breakfast, asking if I wanted to borrow his notes from constitutional law. If anything, he appeared more relaxed than usual, more naturally himself, as if our physical closeness had settled something for him that I was only beginning to understand. The days that followed carried a new quality of attention between us. Nothing dramatic, nothing that an outside observer would necessarily notice, but I felt the shift in every interaction. Isaiah's touches became more frequent, more casual, more deliberate. A hand on my back when he passed behind my chair in the library. His knee pressing against mine during lectures when we sat side by side. Fingers brushing against mine when he handed me books or papers or coffee cups, lingering just a moment longer than necessity required. Each contact sent small electric shocks through my system, reminders of the weight of his head against my shoulder and the trust that gesture had represented. I found myself analyzing every touch for meaning, trying to decode whether these moments of physical connection were conscious choices or simply the natural evolution of our friendship. Isaiah had always been tactile with people he cared about, but this felt different somehow, more intentional, more aware of the effect it might be having on me. The most unsettling part was how right it all felt. I had spent years learning to exist in careful isolation, maintaining the kind of emotional distance that kept me safe from the complications that seemed to follow people who dared to want things from others. But Isaiah's casual intimacy made me crave more contact, not less. I caught myself leaning into his touches, positioning myself in ways that might invite his hand on my shoulder or his leg against mine. I was becoming someone I didn't entirely recognize, someone who sought out physical connection instead of avoiding it. Our conversations began to carry new undercurrents as well. Isaiah started asking questions that felt more personal, more probing, as if he was trying to map the interior landscape of who I was when no one else was watching. He wanted to know about my childhood, my family, the books that had shaped my understanding of myself and the world. He listened to my answers with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for much more important revelations, as if my thoughts on loneliness and belonging carried real weight in his understanding of me. I found myself reciprocating, asking Isaiah about his own experiences with intimacy and friendship, about the ways he had learned to navigate the world with such apparent ease. He told me about feeling like a performer sometimes, about the exhaustion that came from being the person everyone else looked to for energy and optimism. He confessed that he often felt more comfortable in the role of caretaker than in allowing others to care for him, and I began to understand that his falling asleep against me might have been as significant for him as it had been for me. The movie nights continued, but they carried a different charge now. We both knew what had happened the last time. Both remembered the feeling of that unexpected intimacy. The anticipation was almost unbearable, sitting beside Isaiah on his couch, hyper-aware of every shift in his posture, every adjustment of the blanket we shared. I would catch myself watching him more than the screen, noting the way his eyelids grew heavy during quiet scenes, the gradual relaxation of his shoulders as the evening wore on. But Isaiah didn't fall asleep against me again, not immediately. Instead, he seemed to be testing other boundaries, other forms of closeness that might be acceptable between us. He would stretch his legs across my lap during comedies, claiming he needed to elevate his feet after long days on campus. He would share my side of the blanket, even when there was plenty of room on his own side of the couch. Small gestures that felt both innocent and charged with possibility. The tension was excruciating and wonderful in equal measure. I lived for these moments of contact, while simultaneously dreading them, afraid that my reactions might give away the true nature of my feelings. because what I felt for Isaiah was no longer safely contained within the boundaries of friendship, if it ever had been. The weight of his head on my shoulder had unlocked something in me that refused to be put away again. I began to understand that desire could exist in the space between touch and not touch, in the careful negotiation of boundaries that might or might not be crossed. Every evening with Isaiah became an exercise in restraint and hope, in the delicate balance between wanting something desperately and being afraid to reach for it directly. The movie nights stretched on through the semester, each one carrying the memory of that first time he had chosen me as his resting place. I replayed that evening obsessively, trying to decode every moment that had led to his head against my shoulder. Had it been intentional? Had he been testing my reaction? Or had it simply been exhaustion and proximity, a moment of comfort that had happened to occur between two people who cared about each other? But deep down, beneath all my careful analysis and self-doubt, I knew that something fundamental had changed between us. The ease with which Isaiah touched me now, the way he sought out my company and seemed to crave my attention, suggested that our physical closeness had meant something to him as well. I just didn't know what or where it might lead us next. All I knew was that I wanted it to happen again, and I was willing to wait as long as necessary for Isaiah to decide he was ready to trust me with that weight once more. The conversation happened on a Thursday night in early December, 3 weeks after that first time Isaiah had fallen asleep against me. We were halfway through some foreign film he had insisted we watch, something with subtitles and long stretches of silence that made every sound in the apartment seem amplified. The heating system clicking on, the soft rustle of our share blanket, the careful rhythm of two people breathing in the same small space. Isaiah had positioned himself in his usual corner of the couch, but tonight felt different somehow. More charged, more deliberate. He kept glancing at me during the quieter scenes, and I could feel the weight of his attention even when I was pretending to focus on the screen. The film played out its slow, contemplative story while something entirely different built in the space between us. It was during a particularly long scene of the protagonist walking through empty streets that I found myself unable to contain the question that had been circling through my thoughts for weeks. The words came out before I had fully decided to speak them, emerging in a whisper that felt too loud in the quiet room. "You know you fell asleep on me that night," I said. 3 weeks ago, during that thriller. Isaiah's eyes moved from the screen to my face, and I saw something shift in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if he had been waiting for me to bring this up and was relieved that I finally had. He didn't look away or deflect the way I had expected him to. Instead, he held my gaze with that steady attention he gave to things he considered important. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." Those 3 words changed everything. Not because they revealed information I hadn't already suspected, but because they confirmed what I had been afraid to believe. It hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been simple exhaustion or the natural result of a comfortable friendship. Isaiah had been aware of what he was doing when he let his head rest against my shoulder, aware of the intimacy of that gesture and what it might mean to me. The silence that followed felt full rather than empty, charged with all the things we hadn't said to each other yet. Isaiah shifted slightly on the couch, turning his body more fully toward mine, and I could see something in his face that looked like vulnerability, like the careful hope of someone who is about to risk something precious. "I've been thinking about it," he said, "about that night, about what it felt like." The film continued playing, but neither of us was watching anymore. Our attention had narrowed to this conversation, this moment of truth that felt like standing at the edge of something vast and uncertain. I waited for him to continue, afraid that speaking might break whatever spell was allowing him to be this honest with me. "I don't usually do that," he said. "Fall asleep on people. I mean, I could have gone to bed. Should have gone to bed. But I didn't want to. I wanted to stay there with you." His words settled into my chest like something warm and golden, confirmation of hopes I had barely allowed myself to acknowledge. But they also opened up new territories of uncertainty, new questions about what this admission meant for us going forward. I had spent weeks analyzing that night from every possible angle, but I had never prepared for the possibility that Isaiah's awareness of his actions might complicate rather than clarify the situation. What did it feel like? I asked, surprising myself with my boldness. That night, Isaiah was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between my face and some point on the wall behind me. When he spoke, his voice was softer than usual, more careful, as if he was trying to translate something internal into words that could be shared. "Safe," he said finally. It felt safe, like I could let my guard down completely and know that you would take care of me. I've never really had that with anyone before. The feeling that I could just exist without having to perform or entertain or be responsible for making sure everyone else was comfortable. I understood what he meant in a way that made my chest ache. Isaiah moved through the world carrying so much energy for other people, lighting up rooms and making conversations easier and being the person everyone else looked to for reassurance. But with me, in that moment of sleep, he had been able to set that burden down and simply be held. It wasn't just about falling asleep, was it? I said, and it wasn't really a question. No, Isaiah said. It wasn't. The admission hung between us like something delicate and precious, something that required careful handling. I could feel the weight of this revelation, the way it shifted the fundamental nature of our relationship from friendship into something unnamed and more complex. We were no longer two people who enjoyed each other's company. We were two people who had discovered that physical intimacy between us carried a charge that neither of us had expected or entirely understood. The protagonist on screen continued his solitary walk through empty streets, but the parallels to our own situation felt too obvious to ignore. Two people navigating unfamiliar territory, trying to find their way towards something that might or might not exist, guided only by instinct and hope. I thought about all the careful touches that had passed between us since that night, all the moments of connection that had felt both natural and revolutionary. Isaiah's hand on my back in the library, his leg pressed against mine during lectures. The way he had started seeking out my company, not just for scheduled activities, but for the simple pleasure of being near someone who understood him. I wanted to ask what this meant for us, where these revelations might lead, what kind of relationship we were building together in these quiet moments of honesty. But I also understood that some questions were better left unasked for now, that the answers would reveal themselves through actions rather than words. Instead, I simply said, "I'm glad you told me." Isaiah smiled then, the first smile I had seen from him all evening, and it carried a warmth that seemed to fill the entire apartment. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." We turned back to the film, but everything felt different now. The air between us hummed with new possibilities, new understandings about what we meant to each other. The careful distance we had maintained was dissolving, replaced by something more honest and more frightening and more hopeful than anything I had ever experienced before. The night stretched ahead of us, full of unspoken promises and questions that would need to be answered eventually. But for now, it was enough to sit beside Isaiah in the flickering light of his television, knowing that we had both acknowledged the significance of what had passed between us and chosen to honor it rather than pretend it had never happened. The week after our conversation carried a different quality of silence between us. Not the careful distance we had maintained before, but something expectant, charged with possibility. Isaiah and I moved through our usual routines with a new awareness of each other, as if admitting the truth about that first night had shifted the fundamental nature of every interaction that followed. We didn't discuss what had been said, didn't analyze or dissect the meaning of Isaiah's confession that falling asleep against me had felt safe. Instead, we let the revelation settle into the space between us like something precious that required protection rather than examination. But I could feel the change in everything. The way Isaiah looked at me during lectures, the longer pauses in our conversations, the sense that we were both waiting for something to happen, some next step that would define what we were becoming to each other. The following Tuesday arrived with December's particular brand of restlessness. Finals week approaching like a tide, we could see gathering in the distance. Isaiah had suggested another movie night with the casual tone he always used for these invitations, but I heard something different in his voice this time. A question beneath the question. an offering that extended beyond just shared entertainment. When I arrived at his apartment that evening, the familiar ritual felt loaded with new significance. Isaiah had prepared popcorn and arranged the blankets on the couch with what seemed like extra care. The string lights around his windows cast their warm glow across the room, creating the intimate atmosphere we had both grown to associate with these evenings together. He had chosen something quieter tonight, a character study rather than the action films or thrillers we usually watched. Something that would allow for conversation, for the kind of attention to each other that had become more important than whatever story was playing out on screen. We settled into our positions, but everything felt different now. More deliberate, more aware of the potential for contact, for the crossing of boundaries that we had both acknowledged existed between us. Isaiah took his usual corner of the couch, but he left more space beside him than he typically did, as if he was creating an invitation for me to sit closer if I chose to. I accepted the invitation, settling beside him with less of the careful distance I had maintained in our earlier movie nights. Our thighs touched through the blanket, and neither of us moved away. The contact felt both completely natural and electrically charged, a reminder of all the unspoken things that had passed between us in recent weeks. The film began, but I was aware of Isaiah beside me in a way that made following the plot nearly impossible. Every small shift of his body registered in my awareness. Every adjustment of his position seemed to carry meaning, intention, the careful negotiation of someone who was considering possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to explore before. 30 minutes into the film, Isaiah moved. Not the unconscious settling that had led to our first moment of intimacy, but something much more purposeful. He shifted his position slowly, deliberately, leaning into my space with the kind of attention that made it clear this wasn't happening by accident. His shoulder pressed against mine first, a solid warmth that made my breath catch in my throat. Then, with careful precision, he let his weight settle against me, his head finding that same spot on my shoulder where it had rested weeks before. But this time, there was no pretense of sleep, no accidental quality to the contact. Isaiah paused there, his head resting against me, but his body still tense with the awareness of what he was doing. I could feel him waiting, gauging my reaction, giving me the opportunity to object or pull away if this wasn't what I wanted. The question came as a whisper against my shoulder, so quiet I almost missed it beneath the sound of the film's soundtrack. "Is this okay?" 3 words that acknowledged everything. The deliberate nature of his actions, the significance of this contact, the fact that we were choosing to cross boundaries that would change the fundamental nature of who we were to each other. 3 words that offered me the power to define what happened next. I didn't answer with words. Instead, I let my head drop to rest against his, our temples touching in a gesture that felt like both surrender and choice. The movement was small, barely perceptible, but it carried the weight of everything I had been afraid to say aloud. Yes, it was okay. More than okay. It was what I had been hoping for since that first night, when his trust had settled against my shoulder like a gift I hadn't known how to receive. Isaiah's body relaxed completely then, melting into my side with a soft exhale that sounded like relief. His arm came around my waist, not possessively but gently, as if he was asking permission for this additional contact as well. I leaned into the embrace, letting myself be held in a way I had never allowed before. The film continued playing, but we had both stopped pretending to watch. Our attention was entirely focused on this moment of connection, this careful arrangement of bodies and trust that felt more intimate than anything I had ever experienced. Isaiah's breathing settled into the rhythm I remembered from that first night, but he remained awake, present, conscious of every point where our bodies touched. We sat there in the flickering light of the television, holding each other with the careful reverence of people who understood they were crossing into new territory. No grand declarations, no dramatic confessions of feelings that might be too large or too fragile to survive being spoken aloud. Just the simple, revolutionary act of choosing to be close, of allowing ourselves to exist in the space between friendship and something deeper. The weight of Isaiah against me felt different this time. Not just the physical sensation of another person's trust, but the emotional recognition that this was what intimacy looked like. Not passion or drama, but the quiet courage of two people deciding to be vulnerable with each other, to offer and accept comfort in the small, significant ways that actually matter. Time moved differently in that space, each minute stretching to accommodate the magnitude of what was happening between us. The apartment grew quiet around us, the outside world fading into irrelevance as we discovered what it meant to hold and be held by someone who saw you completely and chose you anyway. When the credits finally rolled, neither of us moved to turn off the television. We stayed there in the warm darkness, breathing together, existing in the precious suspension of a moment that felt too perfect and too fragile to disturb. The credits rolled in silence, white text against black fading to nothing, but neither of us reached for the remote. The apartment had grown quiet around us, the heating system settling into its evening rhythm, the string lights casting their gentle glow across walls that had become witnesses to something neither of us had quite known how to name until now. Isaiah's weight against me had shifted during the final scenes of the film, settling deeper into the curve of my shoulder as his breathing found the steady cadence of someone completely at rest. But he wasn't asleep this time. I could feel the conscious quality of his stillness, the way he held himself with the careful attention of someone who understood the significance of every moment of contact between us. My arm had begun to ache again, that familiar sweet discomfort I had first experienced weeks ago, when this kind of closeness was still accidental, still something that could be explained away as simple proximity and exhaustion. But now the ache felt different. Welcome. A physical reminder of the choice we had both made to exist in this space together, to allow our friendship to transform into something that required new language, new ways of understanding what we meant to each other. The television screen had gone dark, leaving us illuminated only by the warm amber light strung around Isaiah's windows. In that gentle glow, the apartment felt suspended from the ordinary world, a private space where time moved according to different rules, where the careful boundaries that governed most relationships could be set aside in favor of something more honest and more vulnerable. Isaiah stirred slightly, adjusting his position without pulling away from me. His arm around my waist tightened just fractionally, a small gesture that felt like a question and an answer simultaneously. Are you still here with me? Yes, I'm still here. Do you want me to stay? Yes, I want you to stay. We had moved beyond the need for words, I realized. The conversation we needed to have was happening in the language of breath and weight, in the careful way Isaiah's fingers had begun tracing abstract patterns against my ribs, in a way I let my hands settle against his hair, stroking the soft strands with a tenderness I had never allowed myself to show another person. This was intimacy I understood now. Not the dramatic version depicted in movies or described in books, but the quiet, revolutionary act of two people choosing to be completely present with each other. No performance, no careful editing of responses or monitoring of reactions. Just the simple courage of existing authentically in the same space, allowing ourselves to be seen and known without reservation. The blanket had shifted during our careful rearrangement, tangling around our legs in a way that seemed to anchor us to this moment, to this choice we had made to cross the invisible line between friendship and something deeper. Isaiah's leg pressed against mine beneath the soft fabric, warm and solid and real in a way that made everything else feel theoretical by comparison. I thought about all the moments that had led us here. The first time Isaiah had laughed at something I said, really laughed with genuine delight rather than polite acknowledgement. The way he had begun seeking out my company between classes, appearing at my usual table in the library, as if we had always shared that space. The careful evolution of our movie nights from casual entertainment to something that felt essential, necessary, like a ritual that sustained some vital part of who we were becoming together. But mostly I thought about that first night when Isaiah had fallen asleep against me without meaning to, and how that accidental intimacy had revealed something neither of us had known we were looking for. The way trust could be communicated through weight, through the simple act of allowing another person to support you when you were too tired to support yourself. Tonight felt like the completion of something that had begun in that moment of unconscious vulnerability. Isaiah choosing to rest against me with full awareness, asking permission, receiving it, and then settling into my embrace with the kind of peace that suggested he had found something he hadn't even realized he was missing. The night stretched ahead of us, but I felt no urgency to move, no anxiety about what this meant for our friendship or what complications might arise from crossing these boundaries. There would be time for those conversations later, time to define what we were becoming and what promises we might be ready to make to each other. For now, it was enough to exist in this perfect suspension of possibility, this moment when everything felt both completely settled and completely open. Isaiah's breathing had deepened into the rhythm of actual sleep now, and I knew I would sit here as long as he needed me to, holding this space, protecting this trust, being the safe harbor he had told me he found in my presence. My own eyes had grown heavy, but I resisted the pull of sleep, wanting to remain conscious of every detail of this night. The weight of Isaiah's head on my shoulder, the soft sound of his breathing, the way the string lights painted everything in shades of gold and amber, making even the ordinary objects in his apartment look touched by magic. Outside, December wind rattled the windows, but inside we had created something that felt impervious to the cold, to doubt, to all the fears that usually kept me from reaching for the things I wanted most. Isaiah had chosen me, and I had chosen him back, and somehow that simple exchange of trust had transformed us both into people capable of this kind of tenderness. The image would stay with me forever, I knew. Two boys on a couch, tangled in blankets and string light, discovering that love didn't always announce itself with grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in the space between one breath and the next, in the weight of another person's trust settling against your shoulder like the most natural thing in the world. I closed my eyes finally, letting myself drift towards sleep while Isaiah's steady breathing counted out the moments of our first night as something more than friends. Whatever we would call this tomorrow, whatever words we would use to define what we had become, tonight we belonged to each other in the most fundamental way possible. We were home,